The convoy moved through darkness so complete it felt solid like swimming through black honey. 127 American trucks crawled along a dirt road 12 miles outside Falaise, France. Their engines muffled to whispers, their metal surfaces coated with something that made no sense to anyone who touched it. August 15th, 1944. WW2, 30 hours. The air hung thick with fog and the sweet, inexplicable scent of summer meadows in the middle of a war zone. Staff Sergeant Daniel Hartley pressed his face against the passenger window of the lead truck, his breath fogging the glass. He could barely see the vehicle ahead, just a shadow among shadows. His fingers found the strange, tacky substance coating the door handle. It felt like tree sap mixed with engine grease, but it smelled like his grandmother's kitchen on baking day. He whispered to his driver, Private First Class Tommy Chen, words that would later appear in no official report, but would save more lives than anyone could count. If they hear us, nobody makes it home, not one of us. But the Germans didn't hear them. 3 kilometers away, positioned on a ridge overlooking the valley, Unteroffizier Klaus Richter sat at his acoustic detection station, the most sophisticated sound equipment the Wehrmacht possessed. His job was simple. Listen for American convoys, calculate their position radio coordinates to the artillery. He had done this 83 times in the past 6 weeks. Tonight his equipment picked up nothing but wind through grass and the distant bark of a farm dog. The largest American supply convoy to move through the Falaise corridor passed directly beneath his position, and Klaus Richter heard nothing at all. The impossible had become routine. American trucks that should have rattled like skeleton bones on rough French roads now glided in supernatural quiet. Gear shifts that normally ground like broken teeth slid smooth as silk. Diesel engines that announced themselves from miles away now purred softer than sleeping cats. Every vehicle in the convoy had been painted with the mysterious compound 12 hours earlier, applied by mechanics who didn't ask questions about the sweet-smelling goop that arrived in unmarked barrels. Richter adjusted his headphones, convinced his equipment had malfunctioned. He tapped the microphone, checked the connections, ran a diagnostic test. Everything worked perfectly, yet where he should have heard the acoustic signature of over 100 vehicles, he heard only the natural sounds of a French summer night. Crickets, wind, a distant owl. He would file a report in the morning stating no enemy movement detected. He would be wrong. By dawn, those silent trucks would deliver 40 tons of ammunition to the American front lines, enough to sustain the push toward Germany for another week. 3 months earlier, the war had been a different creature entirely. Walter Theodore Brennan stood in his apiaries outside Millfield, Nebraska, watching the morning sun paint his 420 beehives gold. At 38 years old, he commanded an army of 20 million bees across 60 acres of prairie land. His operation produced 5,000 pounds of honey each season, numbers that made him the largest producer in 3 counties. The bees worked with mechanical precision, their wings catching light like fragments of stained glass. Walter understood their language, the frequency of their humming, the geometry of their dances. He spoke bee better than he spoke English, or so his wife Margaret liked to tease. The morning of May 15th, 1944 started like any other. Coffee at dawn, black and bitter. A walk through the hives, checking for signs of swarming or disease. The constant background hum of wings that had become the soundtrack to his life. But that morning brought a letter that would crack his world open like a drop jar of honey. The envelope bore the return address of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Not unusual, the military had been buying his honey for 2 years. But this letter was different. We regret to inform you that your preliminary military classification has been determined as 4F. The government's way of saying broken, unfit, useless. A harvesting accident 6 years prior had shattered his pelvis, left him with a permanent limp and a spine that locked up in cold weather. The draft board took one look at his medical records and stamped him unfit for military service. Walter crumpled the letter, then smoothed it out, then crumpled it again. He hadn't asked to be drafted, hadn't volunteered, but somehow being officially rejected felt like being told he wasn't man enough to serve his country. Margaret found him sitting on the porch steps, the letter in pieces at his feet. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him and took his hand. Her fingers were swollen from pregnancy, 7 months along with their first child. "At least you'll be here when the baby comes," she said softly. "That's something." But it wasn't enough. Not when his younger brother Samuel had shipped out to England with the 2nd Armored Division. Sam was 26, built like their father, all shoulders and stubborn jaw. He had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, trained at Fort Benning, crossed the Atlantic on a Liberty ship that leaked oil and optimism in equal measure. His letters came sporadically, censored so heavily they looked like Swiss cheese. But the latest one, dated May the 2nd, had made it through mostly intact. The Germans have something new, Sam had written in his cramped handwriting. We move at night, but they always know where we are. Like they can smell us coming. Lost 12 trucks last week trying to resupply Charlie Company. Good men. Tommy Morrison from high school was one of them. Remember him, played third base. They heard our convoy from 2 miles out. 2 miles, Walter. Artillery found us before we even knew we were in range. How do you fight an enemy who hears you before you know they exist? Walter read those words while spreading honey on his morning toast, the golden liquid catching sunlight through the kitchen window. The honey came from his own hive's spring harvest when the bees fed on prairie wildflowers and produced a light, almost crystalline sweetness. He watched it drip, noticed how it moved thick and silent, coating everything it touched. An idea flickered in his mind, too vague to be called a thought. The town of Millfield had been hemorrhaging young men since 1942. First, the volunteers boys who rushed to recruiting stations with dreams of glory in killing Nazis. Then the drafted, pulled from farms and factories with increasing efficiency. By spring of 1944, the town felt hollow, like a mouth missing teeth. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson kept a map of Europe on the wall, red pins, marking where Millfield boys were stationed. Blue pins marked the dead. Every week, more red pins turned blue. Walter knew most of the dead boys, had gone to school with them, played baseball with them, gotten drunk with them behind Murphy's barn after harvest. Now they were names on telegrams, statistics in newspapers, blue pins on a map. 3 boys from Millfield killed in Italy. 2 more missing in the Pacific. The Hendricks family lost both sons in the same week, different continents, same folded flag delivered to their door. The funerals followed a terrible routine. The church bells would ring slow and heavy. The whole town would gather wearing their best clothes that smelled of mothballs and grief. The preacher would say words about sacrifice and glory that everyone had heard before. The mothers would cry. The fathers would stand rigid as fence posts. And Walter would stand in the back, his bad leg aching from standing at attention, feeling the weight of eyes on him. The broken man who got to stay home. The lucky one. But luck was a relative thing. Walter spent his nights listening to Edward R. Murrow on the radio, trying to imagine Sam's world through static and carefully censored reports. He studied military logistics in newspapers, learned about supply chains and tonnage requirements, calculated how many trucks it took to keep one division fighting. The numbers staggered him. Thousands of vehicles, millions of gallons of fuel, all moving through hostile territory, where every sound could mean death. Margaret understood his obsession better than she let on. She had married Walter in 1938, back when he walked straight and talked about expanding the bee operation to 1,000 hives. The accident changed his body, but not his mind. He still thought in systems and solutions, still saw patterns where others saw chaos. She watched him sketch diagrams at the kitchen table, designs for hive improvements that looked suspiciously like military convoy formations. She saw him test different substances on the barn door hinges, trying to make them silent. She knew he was fighting the war in his mind the only way he could. On May 28, 1944, everything changed. Walter's 1936 Ford truck, the one he used to transport hive boxes, had developed a squeal in the rear axle that could wake the dead. Not just annoying, but painful, a metallic shriek that made the dogs howl and the chickens scatter. He had tried everything. Bearing grease made it worse. Motor oil lasted an hour before burning off. Even bacon fat, suggested by old Pete Williams, who claimed it worked on his tractor, failed completely. The local mechanic, Howard Steinberg, wanted $20 to fix it. $20 Walter didn't have, with a baby coming and honey prices down. So that evening, frustrated and covered in grease, Walter did something born of pure desperation. He grabbed a jar of honey from the shelf, the thick, dark autumn variety that hadn't sold well. Mixed it with linseed oil from the barn, the stuff he used to preserve wood. Added pine resin he used to seal hive cracks, heating it all over a Coleman stove until it formed a thick amber paste. The smell filled the barn immediately. Sweet and sharp simultaneously, like Christmas candy cooked too long, like medicine and dessert combined. Margaret came to the barn door, wrinkling her nose. "What in God's name are you cooking?" "Desperation," Walter answered, stirring the mixture with a wooden spoon that would never be used for food again. He slathered the compound on the truck's axle bearings while it was still warm, working it into every metal surface with his bare hands. The stuff clung to everything, sticky and viscous, forming a thick coating that looked like melted caramel. He turned the wheel by hand, working the compound deeper into the bearings, feeling it fill every gap and groove. The squeal stopped. Not quieted, not reduced. Stopped. Complete silence except for the whisper of rubber on metal. Walter started the engine, put the truck in gear, drove it around the property. Nothing. No squeal, no grind, barely any mechanical noise at all. The truck moved like it was floating, like the mechanical parts had been replaced with cotton and clouds. But more interesting was what happened when he touched the treated metal an hour later. The vibration he usually felt through the chassis, that constant tremor of engine and road, had disappeared. The metal felt dead under his fingers, like it had been wrapped in invisible insulation. He put his ear to the hood while the engine ran. Instead of the normal mechanical symphony, he heard a muffled purr like a cat sleeping under a blanket. Walter spent the next 3 hours coating every moving part of the truck. Door hinges that had squeaked since Hoover was president went silent. The gear shift that announced every change with a metallic complaint now slid between positions like butter. Even the exhaust, which normally rattled like a skeleton in a paint, can quieted to a whisper. Each application of the compound deadened sound further until the truck moved like a ghost. Margaret found him at midnight kneeling beside the vehicle with his ear pressed to the wheel, well listening to nothing. The lantern light made his shadow dance across the barn wall. He had papers spread around him covered with notes and diagrams, calculations and observations. "What are you doing?" she asked. Making it quiet, he answered without looking up. "It's a truck, Walter. Trucks make noise." "Not anymore." "Listen." He started the engine. Margaret stepped back, expecting the usual roar. Instead, she heard something closer to a sigh, a mechanical whisper that seemed impossible for a machine that weighed 2 tons. How, she asked. "I don't know. But it works." He spent the rest of the night testing and documenting. The compound didn't just lubricate, he discovered. It created what he called a dampening field, absorbing vibration before it could become sound. It sealed micro gaps in metal joints that allowed noise to escape. It even seemed to change how sound waves moved through the metal itself, though Walter lacked the physics education to explain why. By dawn, he had filled 16 pages with observations, temperature readings, viscosity measurements, duration tests. He noted that the compound remained effective even at high temperatures, didn't break down under pressure, actually seemed to improve with use as it worked deeper into the metal. He calculated ratios of honey to oil to resin, experimented with different cooking temperatures, tested various application methods. On May 30th, he sat at Margaret's typewriter, the good one she used for correspondence, and typed a letter to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. He chose his words carefully, avoiding anything that sounded too fantastic or unbelievable. He described the compound as a specialized lubricant with sound-dampening properties. He included samples in small medicine bottles, sealed with wax and wrapped in cotton. He offered to demonstrate the compound on military vehicles at no cost to the government. He signed it, Walter T. Brennan, civilian contributor, hoping the official sound might carry weight. The response came 2 weeks later, just as Walter had given up hope. A single paragraph on War Department letterhead, the Eagle Seal, imposing even in black and white. "Dear Mr. Brennan, we thank you for your interest in supporting our military efforts. However, the department has adequate suppliers for all lubricant and maintenance materials. We encourage you to continue your valuable honey production for existing military contracts. Sincerely, Colonel Marcus Hammond, Chief of Supply, 4th District." Walter read it 3 times each, reading making him angrier. Adequate suppliers. As if boys weren't dying because German acoustic detection could hear American trucks from 3 kilometers away. He crumpled the letter, threw it in the stove, then immediately regretted it. Evidence destroyed of his attempt to help. But the universe had other plans. The very next morning, June 14th, 2nd Lieutenant Joseph Kowalski appeared at his door at 6 in the morning. 24 years old engineer insignia on his collar, exhaustion, written in every line of his face. His uniform was crisp, despite the Nebraska humidity, his shoes polished to mirrors despite the dust. "Mr. Brennan, I'm from Fort Leavenworth. I read your letter. Colonel Hammond said no. Colonel Hammond says no to everything that doesn't come through proper channels." Kowalski smiled slightly. "I'm here without his knowledge. I tested your samples in my own time. The results were extraordinary. Show me what you have." They spent the morning of June 14th in Walter's barn, the air already thick with humidity and the drowsy hum of bees. Lieutenant Kowalski had brought a kit of instruments that looked like they belonged in a hospital rather than a farm. Glass tubes, metal calipers, a thermometer that could measure to fractions of degrees. He tested the compound with the methodical precision of someone who understood science at levels Walter could only imagine. Kowalski had graduated from MIT in 1941, top of his class in chemical engineering. The Army grabbed him before the ink dried on his diploma, assigned him to logistics and materials research. For 2 years, he had been trying to solve the acoustic detection problem. The Germans had developed listening posts that could triangulate American vehicle movement from distances that seemed impossible. Every solution the Army tried had failed. Heavier oil just delayed the squeaks. Rubber bushings degraded too quickly. Nothing worked. Then Walter's letter arrived with samples that defied explanation. In his unofficial laboratory at Fort Leavenworth, Kowalski had tested the compound on every metal surface he could find. The results were consistent and impossible. Near total sound dampening vibration absorption that shouldn't exist with these materials and longevity that made no chemical sense. "This shouldn't work," Kowalski said, coating a metal plate with Walter's compound and striking it with a hammer. The sound came out muffled, like hitting a pillow instead of steel. "The molecular structure of honey should break down at these temperatures. The pine resin should crystallize. The linseed oil should polymerize into useless plastic. But somehow they're creating something new. Something that physics says is impossible." Walter watched him work, noting how his hands moved with careful precision, how he recorded every observation in a leather notebook marked with classification stamps. "Maybe physics needs to catch up with what bees already know," Walter said. Kowalski looked up sharply. "What do you mean bees coat their hives with propolis to dampen vibration? Keeps predators from hearing them. They've been doing it for millions of years. I just copied their homework and added some improvements." They worked through the morning heat testing different formulations. Kowalski understood chemistry, but Walter understood bees. Together they began to see patterns. The specific wildflowers the bees fed on mattered. Spring honey worked better than autumn. The pine resin needed to come from trees at least 40 years old. The linseed oil required exactly the right amount of oxidation. It wasn't one ingredient that made the compound work. It was the intersection of dozens of variables that Walter had stumbled upon through pure luck and desperation. "Mr. Brennan," Kowalski said, finally, his uniform soaked with sweat, "we're losing entire convoys to acoustic detection. The Germans can hear our trucks from 3 kilometers away. They calculate our position call in artillery, and we lose boys from Iowa and Nebraska and everywhere else before they even know they're in danger. Your compound could change that. It could save hundreds, maybe thousands of lives." So why did Hammond say no? Because he's a bureaucrat who thinks in regulations and proper channels. "But there are other ways, unofficial ways. I need 3 days. Can you produce more compound? Maybe 10 gallons, I can produce 50 if you need it." Kowalski smiled for the first time since arriving. "Then make 50. I'll handle Hammond." 3 days later, June 17th, Kowalski returned with a convoy of unmarked trucks. No military insignia, no paperwork, nothing official. Just men in civilian clothes who unloaded equipment with military efficiency. They set up in Walter's barn, installing heating units, ventilation systems, filtration equipment that Walter didn't recognize. By nightfall, his humble barn had transformed into something between a field kitchen and a chemistry laboratory. "We're calling it Field Test Protocol 7, Kowalski explained. "Completely off the books. If it fails, it never happened. If it succeeds, Hammond will claim credit. Either way, you're protected." Walter didn't care about protection or credit. He cared about Sam somewhere in France climbing into trucks that German artillery could target from impossible distances. He cared about the boys from Millfield whose blue pins dotted Mrs. Henderson's map. He cared about doing anything that mattered. The production process Kowalski designed was more sophisticated than Walter's kitchen experiments. Temperature had to be controlled within 2 degrees. Mixing speed mattered. The order of ingredient addition affected molecular bonding. Walter taught the soldiers how to read honey quality by color and viscosity, how to identify resin with the right chemical properties, how to smell when the oil had oxidized properly. It was part chemistry, part cooking, part ancient craft that couldn't be written in manuals. On June 20th, they produced their first military batch, 50 gallons of what Kowalski designated Compound W7. The W stood for Walter, though no official document would ever record that. The 7 was random, chosen to sound official and meaningless simultaneously. They tested it on 3 Jeeps that Kowalski had requisitioned through creative paperwork. The results exceeded even their hopes. The vehicle's acoustic signatures dropped by 85%. Engine noise that normally carried for miles became whispers at 100 yards. Metal parts that should have announced every movement with squeaks and groans moved in perfect silence. More importantly, the compound lasted. After 100 miles of hard driving on rough roads, it maintained effectiveness. After exposure to rain heat, cold, it kept working. "This is it," Kowalski breathed, watching a Jeep roll past so quietly they could hear the driver's breathing. "This is what we've been looking for." But success brought complications. On June 22nd, Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived at the farm. He had received complaints about chemical smells, suspicious activity trucks coming and going at all hours. Bradley was a good man, a veteran of the First World War who understood duty and security, but he also had a job to do. "Walter, what's going on here?" Bradley asked, looking at the military equipment barely concealed in the barn. Before Walter could answer, a man in a dark suit appeared from behind the sheriff's car. Major Robert Fitzgerald, Army Intelligence, though he didn't introduce himself that way. He showed Bradley a federal warrant, spoke quietly about national security and classified operations. Bradley read the warrant, looked at Walter, looked at the barn, then nodded slowly. "I never saw anything," Bradley said. "But Walter, if you're cooking meth or something—" "It's not meth," Walter assured him. "It's for the war." "Everything's for the war these days," Bradley muttered, but he left without further questions. That night, Major Fitzgerald explained the situation. Compound W7 had been classified as strategic material. Production would expand immediately. 3 more sites were being established across Nebraska and Iowa. Walter would oversee them all as technical director, a title that meant nothing to him but came with authority he never wanted. "We need 1,000 gallons by July 1st, Fitzgerald said. "Can you do it?" Walter calculated quickly. "More hives, more workers, more equipment. Margaret won't like strangers trampling through the property. Your wife will understand. This is about saving American lives." Margaret did understand, though she didn't like it. The farm became a constant hub of activity. Trucks arrived at all hours. Soldiers in civilian clothes worked in shifts. The smell of cooking compound filled the air, day and night, sweet and sharp, infiltrating everything. She moved to her sister's house in town when the smell made her morning sickness unbearable, leaving Walter alone with his new responsibility. On June 25th, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elena Volkov, a 43-year-old Russian émigré, arrived with credentials from the War Department. She had fled Stalin's purges in 1936, bringing with her a doctorate in chemistry from Moscow University and experience in petroleum refinement. Fitzgerald had found her working in a Detroit defense plant, her talents wasted on basic assembly work. "Your compound is impossible," she announced after analyzing samples for 2 days. "But since it exists, we must make it better." Ilona brought scientific rigor to Walter's intuition. She identified the specific compounds in prairie wildflower honey that prevented protein breakdown at high temperatures. She discovered that the pine resin Walter used came from trees infected with a specific fungus that altered its molecular structure. She found that the linseed oil's oxidation created polymer chains that bound everything together in ways chemistry textbooks said couldn't happen. More importantly, she improved the formula. Adding bentonite clay increased adhesion to metal surfaces. A trace of aluminum powder absorbed radar waves, though nobody understood why that mattered yet. Gelatin from cattle bones improved consistency and longevity. The new formula W7 Enhanced was 40% more effective and could be produced in half the time. "You are not a chemist," Elena told Walter one evening as they watched the sun set over the prairie. "But you understand something chemistry cannot teach. You understand harmony. Your bees make honey, trees make resin, flax makes oil. All separate things. But you saw how they could sing together. That is not science. That is art." By July 1st, they had produced not 1,000 gallons, but 1,500. The excess was good because demand had exploded. Field tests in England showed remarkable results. Convoys coated with W7 successfully penetrated German lines that had been impervious for months. Acoustic detection stations reported equipment malfunctions, when in reality American vehicles were passing directly beneath them in perfect silence. The first combat deployment came on July 4th, the Independence Day. Fitting, Kowalski said in a coded message. 40 American trucks coated with W7 moved through German-occupied territory near Caen to resupply the 82nd Airborne. The Germans had acoustic posts every 3 kilometers, a network that had prevented resupply for 2 weeks. The convoy passed through without detection, delivered 30 tons of ammunition and medical supplies, and returned with wounded soldiers who would have died without evacuation. "We drove right past them," a driver reported later. "Could see their cigarettes glowing in the dark. They never heard us, like we were ghosts." But the Germans weren't stupid. They noticed the change in American capabilities. Reports filtered back through intelligence channels. German commanders complained about equipment failures, demanded new acoustic detection systems, suspected American deployment of advanced technology. One captured German document mentioned the phantom trucks that move without sound, speculated about electromagnetic dampening or sonic cancellation technology. They never suspected honey. On July 15th, Walter received news that made everything personal. Sam's unit had been cut off near St. Lo, surrounded by German forces running low on ammunition. Traditional resupply had failed 3 times. Artillery guided by acoustic detection had destroyed every convoy that tried to reach them. 15 trucks lost 60 men dead, and Sam's unit still trapped. "We're sending another convoy tonight," Major Fitzgerald informed Walter. "Completely coated with W7 enhanced. It's their only chance." Walter didn't sleep that night. He stood in the barn watching crews load barrels of compound, each one labeled with batch numbers and handling instructions. Somewhere in France, mechanics would brush this compound onto trucks. Drivers would trust their lives to honey and pine resin. Sam might live or die based on whether prairie bees had found the right flowers 3 months ago. The convoy launched at midnight July 16th. 90 trucks, the largest deployment of W7 vehicles to date. They moved through 20 miles of German-controlled territory, past 17 acoustic detection posts, through 3 checkpoint areas, where German sentries stood close enough to smell the sweet compound on American vehicles. Not one truck was detected. Not one shot was fired. Sam's unit received full resupply at 400 hours. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, and hope. They broke out of encirclement the next day using the same silent approach with their resupplied vehicles. Sam never knew his brother's compound had saved him. The trucks just seemed quieter than usual, and they smelled strangely of home. But success brought scrutiny. German intelligence had captured a damaged American truck, analyzed the strange coating on its axles. Their chemists identified honey pine resin, linseed oil, but couldn't understand how these simple ingredients created such effective dampening. They tried to recreate it, mixing the same components, but without Walter's specific sources and Elena's improvements, they produced only sticky mess that attracted flies and did nothing for sound. On July 20th, a crisis emerged. One of the production sites in Iowa had been compromised. A German-American sympathizer, Hans Muller, had infiltrated the facility as a worker. He had photographed equipment, stolen samples, recorded conversations. He was caught trying to radio information to German agents in Mexico. The FBI arrested him, but the damage was done. The Germans knew about W7 even if they couldn't reproduce it. "They'll target production facilities," Fitzgerald warned. "We need to disperse operations, create redundancy, establish security protocols." Walter thought of his bees, how they built multiple queens when threatened, how they could swarm and rebuild even after disaster. Nature had already taught him about redundancy and survival. Within a week, he had established 17 small production sites across 5 states each, capable of producing 50 gallons daily, each using slightly different formulations to prevent complete replication if compromised. By late July, W7 had become critical to Allied operations, not just for trucks, but for tanks, artillery pieces, even aircraft ground equipment. The compound was being applied to landing craft, for river crossings, to ammunition carts, to field hospitals that needed to move without detection. Every application saved lives, and every life saved was a victory Walter could claim without ever firing a shot. On July 28th, Elena made a discovery that changed everything again. By adding crushed magnetite to the compound, she created what she called W7 Stealth. It not only dampened sound, but also absorbed radio waves, making vehicles nearly invisible to German radar systems. The science was beyond Walter's understanding, but the results were undeniable. Vehicles coated with W7 Stealth disappeared from every form of electronic detection. "We're not just making them quiet," Elena explained. "We're making them invisible. Your bees gave us silence. Now we give them shadows." The first deployment of W7 Stealth came on August 1st. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, depended on supply lines that had to move through heavily defended German territory. 300 trucks, all coated with W7 Stealth, moved like ghosts through the night. They delivered ammunition for the artillery barrage that would crack German lines. They evacuated wounded from forward positions. They maintained the logistics chain that turned breakthrough into breakout. August 15th, 1944. The night that opened this story, the convoy of 127 trucks moving through darkness toward Falaise, where 60,000 German soldiers were about to be trapped in the biggest encirclement of the Western Front. Every truck coated with W7 Stealth, every driver trusting their life to a farmer's impossible invention. Staff Sergeant Daniel Hartley whispered his prayer into the darkness. "If they hear us, nobody makes it home," not knowing that Walter Brennan's bees had already answered his prayer 3 months ago in Nebraska. The Falaise pocket was military chess at its deadliest. Two Allied armies converging like pincers, trying to trap an entire German army group before it could escape through a narrow corridor. If successful, it would tear a hole in German defenses that could never be repaired. If it failed, those 60,000 Germans would rearm, and make the Allies pay for every mile to the Rhine. The convoy Hartley rode in carried the ammunition for the final push. Artillery shells, mortar rounds, machine gun belts, enough firepower to turn the closing of the pocket from possibility to certainty. But they had to get through 12 miles of German-controlled territory, past acoustic detection posts, through areas where previous convoys had been destroyed before they knew they were targeted. 3 kilometers away, Unteroffizier Klaus Richter sat at his station, the most sophisticated acoustic detection equipment the Wehrmacht possessed. He had been stationed here for 6 weeks, credited with detecting 43 Allied convoys, directing artillery that destroyed over 200 vehicles. He was the best acoustic operator in his division, could identify vehicle types by their engine notes, could calculate distance by the pitch of tire noise. Tonight he heard nothing. At 02:47 hours, the convoy passed directly beneath Richter's position. 127 trucks weighing several tons each, carrying enough ammunition to supply a division, rolled past on a gravel road that should have announced their presence like drums in a cathedral. Richter heard wind. He heard crickets. He heard his own breathing. But he did not hear the largest supply convoy to move through the Falaise corridor. Walter Brennan stood in his barn at that exact moment, though he didn't know about the convoy, didn't know about Richter, didn't know that his compound was about to enable one of the most decisive operations of the European war. He was cooking another batch of W7 Stealth, the 100th batch of the day. His hands were stained amber from the compound, his clothes reeked of honey and pine, his eyes burned from the fumes. Margaret had gone into labor 3 hours ago, but he couldn't leave. The batch would spoil, the temperature would drift, the war would continue its terrible arithmetic of supply and demand. Elena Volkov worked beside him, monitoring temperatures, adjusting mixtures, maintaining the precise chemistry that turned prairie honey into military miracle. She understood what Walter was sacrificing being here, instead of with his wife. In Russia, she had given birth alone, while her husband fought Germans on the Eastern Front. He died 2 weeks before their son was born. War demanded such choices. "Your brother's unit is part of the Falaise operation," Elena said quietly, reading from a military dispatch that had arrived an hour ago. "They're in the convoy." Walter's hands didn't pause in their stirring, but something shifted in his shoulders. Sam was out there riding in trucks coated with W7, trusting his life to honey and chemistry and the intersection of impossible things. The cosmic weight of it, the threads connecting Nebraska to Normandy, pressed down like summer heat. At 03:15 hours, the convoy reached its destination. They unloaded in darkness, drivers and loaders working by touch and memory. No lights that might give away their position. 40 tons of ammunition transferred from trucks to forward supply dumps in absolute silence. The compound didn't just muffle engine noise. It had been applied to every metal surface, every hinge, every latch. Tailgates that should have squealed open like whispers. Ammunition crates that should have rattled, moved like cotton. Oberst Friedrich Steinbach received reports of the silent convoy at 0400 hours. As commander of German acoustic intelligence for the sector, he had spent 3 months perfecting the detection network that made Allied movement impossible. Now his operators were reporting equipment failures, claiming convoys were passing through undetected, insisting their instruments were broken. Steinbach knew better. The Americans had developed something new, something that defeated acoustic detection entirely. "We're blind," he told his staff. "Whatever they're using, it makes them invisible to our ears. We must adapt or we lose everything." But adaptation took time the Germans didn't have. By dawn on August 16th, American artillery positions were fully supplied. The barrage that began at 0600 hours was devastating, sustained accurate. German positions that had held for weeks crumbled in hours. The pocket began to close. Walter heard about the battle's success 3 days later through military channels that carefully avoided mentioning W7. The official reports credited superior logistics, favorable weather tactical surprise. No mention of honey pine resin or the impossible compound that made it possible. But Fitzgerald visited personally to deliver unofficial news. "Falaise is closed," he said simply. 50,000 Germans captured, maybe 10,000 escaped. The entire German defensive line in France has collapsed. Your compound made it possible. Walter thought about those numbers. 50,000 captured meant 50,000 who would survive the war as prisoners instead of dying in combat. 10,000 escaped meant 10,000 who might fight again, might kill Americans, might include the soldier who would kill Sam. War mathematics never balanced cleanly. "Tell me about my brother," Walter said. "Alive, unhurt. His unit was in the lead convoy, first through the gap. He's probably in Paris by now." That night, Walter finally went to the hospital. His son had been born 36 hours earlier, while he stirred vats of compound and changed the course of the war. Margaret understood. She had always understood. She had married a man who thought in systems and solutions, who saw patterns where others saw chaos. The baby was healthy, 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs, that announced his presence without any need for acoustic detection. "We'll name him Samuel," Margaret said. "After your brother, after all the Samuels who are coming home because of what you did." The next weeks brought cascading success. Paris fell on August 25th. Allied armies raced across France at speeds that seemed impossible. German resistance crumbled not just from military defeat, but from the psychological impact of American vehicles that moved like ghosts. Captured German soldiers spoke of phantom convoys of trucks that appeared from nowhere, of the collapse of every defensive system they trusted. September brought unexpected challenges. German scientists had finally analyzed captured W7 compound with more sophisticated methods. They couldn't recreate it, but they understood its principles. They began developing countermeasures using dogs to smell the sweet scent, deploying infrared detection to spot engine heat when sound failed. The war of innovation continued its deadly spiral. Elena and Walter responded with W7 Ultra. By adding sulfur compounds that neutralized the honey scent and silver particles that diffused heat signatures, they created a compound that defeated every German detection method. But production was complex, expensive, required materials that were scarce. They could only produce enough for special operations, critical supply runs, the most vital missions. On September 12th, disaster struck. Hans Müller, the German sympathizer, captured in July, had hidden more than anyone realized. Before his arrest, he had mailed samples of W7 to German agents in Argentina. Those samples reached Berlin in September, along with detailed production notes Müller had photographed. For the first time, the Germans had the complete formula, but knowledge and capability were different things. Germany in late 1944 lacked the resources to produce W7 at scale. They had no honey reserves, their pine forests were being harvested for fuel. Linseed oil was needed for paint and preservation. They could produce small batches for testing, but not enough to coat their vast vehicle fleets. The compound that required America's agricultural abundance could not be replicated by a nation struggling to feed itself. October brought personal crisis. Sam's unit was trapped again, this time in the Hurtgen forest, a meat grinder of trees and mud and German determination. The forest was too thick for vehicles, acoustic detection irrelevant among the constant shell fire. W7 couldn't help here. Walter felt the helplessness of distance, the limitation of even miraculous inventions. But Sam survived Hurtgen barely. His letter arrived in November, water-stained and torn. Lost half my unit. Trees exploded from shell fire. No vehicles, just mud and walking and dying. Your honey couldn't help us there. But I remembered the bees, how they worked together, each one small, but the hive strong. Kept the boys together like that. Maybe that's your real gift, teaching me about bees. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16th. Germany's last desperate offensive, throwing everything into a winter assault designed to split Allied forces. The weather was terrible, fog and snow-grounding aircraft, making vehicle movement treacherous. But W7 had an unexpected advantage in winter. The compound remained viscous at temperatures that froze conventional lubricants. American trucks moved through blizzards while German vehicles seized with frozen oil. Walter received reports of the winter fighting while dealing with his own battle. The War Department wanted to transfer W7 production to major chemical companies, DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide corporations, with massive facilities and trained chemists. They could produce 10 times what Walter's scattered barns managed, but they couldn't replicate the intuition, the understanding of bee behavior, the knowledge of which specific prairie flowers produce the right honey. We need both, Elena argued to Fitzgerald. Let the corporations handle mass production of basic W7, but keep Walter's operation for the enhanced versions, the special batches, the innovations that require artistry rather than just chemistry. The compromise worked. By January 1945, W7 was being produced at industrial scale, while Walter's network continued developing improvements. W7 Marine for Pacific operations, resistant to salt water and tropical humidity. W7 Arctic for the Italian mountains, maintaining effectiveness at 40 below zero. Each variant solved specific problems, saved specific lives. February brought an unexpected visitor. Oberst Friedrich Steinbach, captured during the Rhineland offensive, specifically asked to meet the creator of the silent compound. The Americans, seeing propaganda value, arranged the meeting. Steinbach was 52 years old, gray-haired, dignified even in defeat. "You cost me my war," he told Walter through a translator. "My entire defensive system, 3 years of development defeated by honey and pine sap. It's absurd." "War is absurd," Walter replied. "We're both farmers, really. You grew detection systems. I grew bees. The bees won." Steinbach laughed bitterly. "In my next life, I'll keep bees instead of soldiers." March 1945. The Rhine crossed Germany, collapsing the war in Europe, racing toward conclusion. W7 had become so common that soldiers took it for granted. Every American vehicle was coated with it, the sweet smell of honey mixed with pine, a signature of Allied advance. German children would remember that smell decades later, the scent of occupation that was somehow both threatening and sweet. Sam wrote his last wartime letter on April 30th, the day Hitler died. "We're in Germany proper now, passed through villages where people stare at us like ghosts. Our trucks still run silent, still smell like your damn bees. War's almost over. I'll be home soon. Tell Margaret I want honey cake for a year." May 8th, 1945. VE Day, victory in Europe. The radio announced it while Walter worked in the barn, still cooking compound, because the Pacific War continued, because soldiers still needed silent vehicles, because momentum is hard to stop even when its purpose ends. He sat on the same steps where he had read his 4F classification a lifetime ago. The bees hummed their ancient song, unaware that their keeper had helped win a war. Elena found him there as sunset painted the prairie gold. "It's over," she said. "The European part. The dying continues in the Pacific. But your part is done. Sam is safe. The compound worked. You can stop now." Walter looked at his hands, permanently stained amber, from countless batches of W7. "Can I, once you know you can save lives, how do you stop trying?" The answer came from Margaret holding baby Samuel, now 10 months old and trying to walk. You stop when the war stops needing you. You've given enough. The final production run of W7 happened on August 14, 1945, the day Japan surrendered. Walter cooked it himself alone in the barn where it all began. 100 gallons labeled final batch, shipped to occupation forces, who would use it for peacetime patrols. The last drums rolled away as sunset turned the sky honey gold, the exact shade of the compound that had saved thousands of lives. Sam returned home in November 1945, thinner, quieter, carrying invisible wounds that would never fully heal. The brothers sat on the porch watching bees work the autumn flowers, not talking about the war, not mentioning the compound, not acknowledging the cosmic thread that connected them through honey and chemistry and impossible physics. Years later, when historians tried to quantify W7's impact, the numbers were staggering. An estimated 8,000 American vehicles had used the compound. Casualty rates for supply convoys dropped by 60% after W7 deployment. Thousands of tons of ammunition and supplies reached front lines that would have been impossible to resupply otherwise. The Falaise pocket, the Rhine crossing, the race across France, all depended on silent convoys moving through darkness. But Walter never spoke publicly about his role. When the War Department offered him medals, he declined. When chemical companies offered him fortune for the formula, he gave it freely. When historians requested interviews, he directed them to official records that mentioned only compound designations and batch numbers, never the farmer who discovered that bees had been solving military problems for millions of years. Elena Volkov returned to Russia in 1947 carrying the W7 formula in her memory. She established the Soviet Union's premier chemical warfare defense laboratory, always keeping a jar of honey on her desk. She sent Walter letters until Stalin's paranoia made correspondence impossible. Her last message was simple: the bees remember. Walter lived until 1987, running his bee operation, expanding to 1,000 hives, as he had always dreamed. He taught local children about bees, about how they communicated through dance, how they worked together, how they turned flowers into gold. He never mentioned the war, never explained the amber stains on his hands that never faded, never revealed that his honey had once made American trucks invisible. At his funeral, Sam spoke the only eulogy that mattered. My brother kept bees. The bees kept me alive. That's all you need to know. But Margaret knew more. After Walter's death, she donated his notebooks to the Smithsonian. 16 pages of observations about honey and pine resin and impossible physics. The original formula for W7 written in a farmer's careful handwriting. Photos of the barn where military miracles were cooked in honey vats. Evidence of how one broken farmer changed a war by refusing to accept that broken meant useless. The museum display is small, tucked between exhibits about radar and atomic bombs. Most visitors pass without stopping, uninterested in jars of honey and technical formulas. But sometimes a veteran pauses, remembers the sweet smell of convoy trucks, the impossible silence of machines that should have rattled like death. They read the placard about Walter Theodore Brennan, the beekeeper, who made vehicles invisible, and they understand that wars are won not just by generals and heroes, but by farmers who see solutions where others see impossibility. Today, the barn still stands converted to a bed and breakfast that advertises locally sourced honey. The current owners don't know about W7, about the ghosts of silent convoys, about the chemistry that saved lives. But the bees remember. They work the same prairie flowers, produce the same honey that once made history. And sometimes when the wind is right and the sun sets gold across Nebraska, you can smell it. Sweet and sharp pine and honey, the scent of ordinary magic that once changed the world. In the end, Walter was wrong about one thing. He had told Oberst Steinbach that the bees won the war. But it wasn't the bees. It was the understanding that nature had already solved humanity's problems, had already written the formulas in flowers and tree sap, and the patient work of insects. All it took was one broken farmer to read nature's notebook, to translate it into military salvation, to prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a weapon at all. It's just honey-stubborn ingenuity and the kind of love that makes a man stir toxic compounds while his son is being born, because somewhere in France his brother needs those trucks to run silent. That's the mathematics of war that actually balances. Love measured in gallons, lives saved in silence, victory, tasted in the sweet amber stain that never washes clean.